you believe in curses?" I didn't consider myself a superstitious person. I didn't believe in the paranormal, and generally considered the ramblings of superstition to be more like modern mythology. People just taking allegories of concepts and held beliefs and trying to give them solid meaning and agency by attaching some force to it that moves beyond the belief of what our own eyes can see. Recent events, though, have forced me to reconsider my beliefs on the paranormal. What I have come to learn and to fear is that not believing in superstition might not change how it can affect you. Despite not believing this sort of thing myself, I might have to start. See, I think I might be cursed. Silly thing for a skeptic to say, I know. But I'll tell you the story of the last few days, and maybe you can tell me if it sounds like I am or not. Maybe I'm just being paranoid. The tragedy of recent events having drowned my skeptical mind in a wave of the paranormal beliefs of others. Though I fear the nagging feeling that it could be real. If this is all real, then I think I might be in trouble. 2 weeks ago, my girlfriend Heather and I were on the way to a somber event. It was the funeral service of her best friend, Gwen, and she was trying her best to compose herself, but was having a hard time. "I don't know if I can do this," she said for the 3rd time since we had departed, her sleeve wet with tears before we had even arrived. I tried my best to comfort her, but she was taking the loss of her friend hard. "It'll be okay, honey. I know it's hard, all of this has been, but I know she would have wanted you to be there to remember her, along with all her other friends and family." I told her that, not really knowing if it was true, since I didn't know much about her friend Gwen before she had passed so suddenly. I put a reassuring hand on her shoulder, without diverting too much attention from driving through the light traffic in the small town the service was held at. "I know, I just can't believe she's gone," she said, while wiping her eyes a final time as we arrived at the funeral home. It was a gloomy day outside. Clouds shrouded any possible rays of sunshine. The sky threatened rain, yet was not quite ready to unleash the downpour. A very fitting day for a funeral, I thought to myself, and I opened Heather's door and helped her out of the car. We stepped out and saw a large group of people in dark-colored clothes gathered near the entrance. Moving towards the group, Heather noticed Gwen's parents and suppressed another sob. I tried to reassure her again, and we moved to greet them and express our condolences. It was tough seeing the pained resolve on their faces as many cried around them, but they did their best to stay composed and thank each person for coming. The service hadn't started yet, but apparently the viewing had. We were told to head inside and to pay our respects and view the body if we wished, or to just write a memorial note. Heather decided she was feeling strong enough to go to the viewing, and I held her hand as we entered. There were others there, softly crying or solemnly looking on in quiet respect. 2 individuals caught my eye, though. I suppose Gwen's family was religious, but these 2 looked a bit extreme. They were wearing some sort of religious regalia and holding crucifixes. They seemed to hold them up and mutter some sort of prayer. Not too odd if they were priests or something. But it got strange when I heard something whispered quietly about how the Lord banishes all evil, and through his light we ask for an end to this bloody reaping. We pray for forgiveness. The robed figures finished the chant and made the sign of the cross one last time, and left the body in the viewing room, looking back at us as they left in an oddly paranoid way, like they didn't trust something about us being in the room. I brushed it off, and Heather didn't seem to notice or care about the strange priests or whatever they were, or the weird sermon about evil they seemed to have had with her friend's body. We approached the coffin slowly, and Heather began crying again. I looked down into the finely carved casket and saw her. The embalming process always alters the look of people, no matter how skilled they are. It's just not quite them anymore. I felt terrible for Heather and how she lost her friend, and I felt even worse for Gwen, of course. To have a heart attack at 34 was a genuine tragedy. She had had no underlying health issues of note, and lived a fairly active and healthy lifestyle, so it was even more puzzling to everyone who had known her. I had been holding Heather's hand, but as we stepped closer, she broke away and reached down and touched the hand of her friend and said her last goodbyes. I looked on and felt moved by the touching scene and felt a shade of the deep sadness that she had felt for her lost friend. In my sympathetic reverie, I received a sudden flash of deep and profound sadness, which I thought made sense. What I was not prepared for was what felt like a strange buzzing tension in the air, and a feeling of unbridled anger, like when a furious person is staring someone else down. I looked over my shoulders and across the room, but no one else was in there with us at the moment. Then I felt a strange pain in the back of my ears, almost like they were suddenly ready to pop. It felt very strange, but I had no idea what was happening. I was just standing there, unmoving, looking at Heather hold her friend's hand and say her goodbyes. Then I noticed her hand and saw something disturbing. As Heather held Gwen's right hand, I noticed what may have been an oversight by the makeup and mortuary workers who were supposed to prepare the bodies for viewing. There were fairly pronounced scratches in irregular patterns on the top portions of her fingers. They were initially hard to see, but they were definitely there, down about halfway on each digit. I had a strange vision that they brightened and thrummed in time with the disturbing feeling in the air. I didn't like that weird synchrony. I moved closer to try and put a hand on Heather's shoulder, but suddenly, the bubble popped, and the pressure in my head exploded as it felt like both my eardrums popped, and the blinding headache almost made me cry out. Before I could, though, I heard Heather cry out first, not in grief, but in pain. She was startled out of her own grieving by the pain of something, and she clutched her own right hand and looked down at a small but deep cut on her right index finger. It was bleeding a good bit for how small it seemed, and I quickly grabbed some tissues nearby and helped her cover it. What happened? Was there something sharp left in her casket? I asked her, while still holding her hand and trying to steady her. I don't know. There was nothing there. I was just holding her hand. Her poor hand. Whoever did her makeup and preparation should be ashamed. She hated that color. And whatever it was in there cut her hand as well, Heather responded, looking on the verge of crying again, and trying to distract her grief with temporary anger over the thought of her best friend's preparation not being perfect. We both saw another group waiting to enter and realized our time was up, so we exited the viewing room. I was able to get a Band-Aid from the car's first aid kit for Heather's cut. By that time, it had stopped bleeding, even though it looked disturbingly deep. I bandaged it anyway and disinfected it just to be safe, and Heather let out another whimper of pain. I apologized profusely, and we composed ourselves and went to the main hall for the ceremony. The main service was set to start in about 20 minutes, but we never sat for the service. We had to leave about 10 minutes later. We were settled in, and I thought we would be okay, but I heard Heather quietly mumble, "Not now, not now." I asked her if she was all right, and she groaned in pain again and held her hand to her forehead. "No, not right now. I can't do it. I need to go. We need to go." She stood up and grabbed my arm, and we left. Not too many people noticed us leaving since we were close to the back, but I shot an apologetic look at those who did. Rushing through the hall, I noticed the robed figures again, and they seemed to regard Heather and I with a new apprehension, and they cleared out of our way and crossed themselves as we moved quickly down the hall and past them. We moved quickly since Heather was pulling me along, but as we departed, I thought I heard one of them say something in Latin or something. It sounded like maledictionem. We rounded the corner, and I realized where she had been rushing. She made it to the restroom and promptly went in, and I heard vomiting followed by sobbing, and then a sink running, and the door opening again. It's a migraine. Right now, of all times. It's so bad I can barely see straight, and I puked at Gwen's funeral. I can't believe this. We can't stay. We have to go. I can't do this right now. I said my goodbye to her. We have to go. I'm so sorry, Gwen, Heather said while she continued to cry and clutch her head. I held her arm, and we quickly moved back out to the car and headed home. On the way home, the sky finally decided to open up and a torrential rain began. Despite the pounding of the rain on the car, I couldn't hear much over Heather's anguished moaning. I didn't know what was worse for her at that moment, the migraine or the sadness over her friend. Yet, despite the professed agony of the migraine, she seemed to be holding her hand like it was still wounded, and in particular, the finger that had been cut in Gwen's casket. I thought it was strange, but she seemed to writhe in pain like that small cut hurt worse than her migraine. I was so distracted by the scene, I almost rear-ended a car in front of me and had to slam on my brakes. I apologized to Heather and asked if she was okay, but she just held her hand on her face and didn't seem to notice the jarring stop we had come to. Something was off. She was normally terrified of traffic and driving in the rain, but barely noticed when we almost got into a crash. We arrived home, and Heather went straight to bed and fell into a fitful sleep. Outside, the rain had become a full thunderstorm and was raging, strong winds picking up as well. I was afraid the power might go out, so I started looking for some candles or flashlights. The twilight hour mixed with the pressing storm gave the outside look a disturbing, hellish red quality that seemed an eerie nightcap to the day's disturbing and sad events. Heather had stayed asleep, and I was about to join her when I heard screaming from upstairs, and I rushed up to check on her. Heather was bolt upright, panting and heaving and clutching her hand. She started whispering and saying, "I'm sorry, Gwen. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Not us. Please, not us." Over and over. I sat down and reached across the bed to try and comfort her, but when I touched her shoulder, she whirled around and struck my hand. And for a moment, she had a distorted and deranged appearance on her face. The next second, she recovered and looked confused and horrified that she had just struck me, and proceeded to apologize repeatedly to me and then back to Gwen again. I had no idea what was going on, but I was getting worried about her mental health. As she finally settled back down, she rolled over and fell back asleep. I tried to settle in and ignore that nagging feeling that something was very wrong. I know everyone grieves differently, but the way she'd been acting was worrying. I hoped that tomorrow would be better. I was about to drift off when I heard a disturbing sound that made my stomach turn. It sounded sort of like fingernails cutting into skin. It was faint at first, but eventually I realized it was coming from Heather, and I sat up and hopped out of bed and slowly moved around to her side to get a look at her prone form rolled over facing the opposite way. To my horror, she still seemed asleep, but was unconsciously scratching deep cuts into her right middle finger with the nails on her left. The old cut had been opened as well, and her hand was bleeding profusely again. "Oh my God, Heather, wake up!" I shouted and shook her shoulders, and she woke with a scream. Before she knew what was happening, I had a towel in hand and was covering her bleeding fingers. "What happened? I thought I was asleep," she mumbled out in a dazed and dreamy-sounding voice, seemingly oblivious to any pain caused by the self-mutilation. I had no idea how she'd not known she was doing that, or how she couldn't feel it. She was showing a disturbing degree of dissociation since she had come back from the funeral, and I was worried she might be having a mental breakdown. I brought some first aid supplies and went to clean her wounds. When I went to disinfect and bandage her fingers, I saw an odd and seemingly deliberate pattern that had been carved into the fingertips. I don't know how, but it looked disturbingly familiar. I took a picture of the morbid design and tried showing it to her. When I showed her the work she had done to her own finger, she merely said, "Oh, that's what that was." Then, as if uninterested by the conversation, she fell asleep again. Nothing about this was right. I needed to see what was happening with Heather. The next day was worse, and Heather woke up with a very high fever. I tried to give her medicine for it, and she seemed weirdly mistrustful and would slap the Tylenol out of my hands and stare at me as if I had just tried to kill her. "I know what you're trying to do. I know," she muttered, though not looking at me when she spoke. Despite the accusation and look, she seemed to be talking to herself or someone else and not me. I decided to call her parents and see if they could talk to her and help. It was strange though, since the line seemed to be dead when I called on both of our phones. I called her sister as well, and no answer. It was getting weirder and weirder. The storm had hardly abated outside, and I was concerned about leaving Heather in this state and venturing out into the tempest to get her help. She lay on the couch, feverish and rambling, and staring weirdly at her hands for minutes at a time. I tried to let her rest, but as the storm picked up outside, I saw her visibly sweating, and I took her temperature. It was 105 degrees. I had to get her fever down, so I tried to wake her and take some medicine and run a cool shower for her. Heather's eyes blinked open, and a hazy look had glossed over her entire face as she sat up and struck me in the head. knocking down the offered medicine again. "Not again, not again, no more, not upon us." She started ranting and screaming at me. I tried to calm her down, but she hurled a nearby chair at me, and I had to flee the living room and run upstairs while trying to talk to her and de-escalate. Despite my attempts at reaching her, she didn't seem to be listening to me or anyone in the room, just some other perceived being. She seemed to be alternating between directing her fury at something, then apologizing to it. "Why did you leave? Why did you do this to me? It's not fair. Why her? Why me?" She screamed ever louder until falling silent and collapsing on the floor. I needed help. Something was very wrong. I didn't know if this was a psychotic break or if the fever had addled her into a violent frenzy, but she needed help, now. So I dialed 911 and called an ambulance. Mercifully, I got through and was able to call for help. After hanging up the phone, I looked back where I expected the prone form of Heather, only to find her bolt upright and carving her hand with a kitchen knife. It was those creepy lines. She had slashed them on her remaining fingers and was holding up her hand in a bloody spectacle, as if checking her work. She looked at me with a deranged smile that shifted to an agonized look of pure despair and said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Her, me, you, all of it. It's all going to end. No stopping it now." The air in the room became heavy, and the pressure in my head reminded me of how I felt when we were viewing Gwen at the service. My head ached, my teeth hurt, and I sat there paralyzed with dread, watching Heather hyperventilate and look at her ruined hand until suddenly the air swept out of the room and my eardrums burst, and Heather fell to the floor. Her eyes were open, and she wasn't breathing. I held her hand and tried to perform CPR on her, yet to no avail. She was dead before emergency services arrived. I sat in disbelief next to her lifeless form, holding her hand and crying. I was in utter shock. How could she have died? When the EMTs arrived, they tried to resuscitate, but were unsuccessful. It was declared as a cardiac failure. That was all they could surmise as for what could have killed her. A heart attack, just like Gwen. When they moved her away and placed her on the gurney, I felt a sharp pain on my hand, and I realized that her nails must have scratched my finger or something. As I looked down at my right index finger, I saw a bloody line formed near the top down past the nail, in a disturbing pattern that caught my eye. I was barely able to give my statement over the blinding headache I'd developed. Despite the shock, grief, and general horror of the events that unfolded before me, I was suddenly very tired. When the emergency services had left, I felt so overwhelmed by the tragedy of what I had experienced that I collapsed into a heap on the couch and passed out. I had horrible dreams while I slept, of Gwen and Heather, out under the red, stormy sky, calling to me. I felt the terrible pressure in the air and that feeling of unbridled anger. I saw flashes of the strange priests and the word they whispered, maledictionem. That was last night. When I awoke from the horrible dreams, I came to a disturbing realization. This cut. It's like the cut that Heather had. She held Gwen's hand, and in a few days, she was dead as well. I don't know what the hell is happening, but I'm even more disturbed by the word those priests spoke. Maledictionem. It turns out it was Latin after all, and what it roughly translates to is the curse. I can scarcely believe it. Does this mean they thought this was some sort of death curse? No, that's impossible. I'm just letting the grief and trauma of the last few days color my reality with nonsense. Yet, as I write this, my head is getting foggy again, and I fear what will happen to me next. Grief can make us experience terrible things. It can drive us mad, and it can reap a physical toll. I know it's grief over losing her in such a terrible way. I can't believe she's gone. I can't physically cope, that's all. I'm destroyed emotionally, but I'll be okay. Curses can't be real. No. The grief is real. I'll manage. Everything will be okay. Somehow. Sorry. I'll need to update everyone another time. I need to clean myself up. I managed to get a terrible paper cut on my middle finger, and it's bleeding a lot. It's funny. I never thought a paper cut could look so strange. It almost matches the other scratch. And it looks oddly familiar.